They've been referred to as a shockwave, the big bulge, and now a silver tsunami. This group has had a big impact on society. We're talking about the baby boomers. Who are the boomers? The boomers are a lot of people, says Duke sociologist Mary Hughes. Let's start from the beginning. Preceding the boomers, the 30s through the 40s was a period of economic depression and war. The end of World War II marked a turning point. Afterwards, many soldiers returned, ready to start families. In the US, the GI Bill gave them extra security. Plus, we were entering the post-war economic boom. And so, the baby boom began. Nearly 20% more babies were born in 1946 than 1945 in the US, and there were similar trends in many other countries around the world. As the cohort has moved through society, they've had an impact on basically everything. There weren't enough teenagers to babysit them, so that brought up babysitting wages.
Well, that's that. No babysitter.
There weren't enough schools in some areas, and so more had to be built. Businesses created toys, clothes, musical records, cars, blue jeans, and more with boomers in mind. The amount spent to advertise products doubled in the 50s, with toy companies being a big part of that. And in 1966, Time magazine selected the baby boom generation as Man of the Year. Today, there are many concerns around supporting a large aging population, especially in relation to things like healthcare. Their size, relative size to the surrounding generations and general population, and the time period in general all played a role. But in his book, Boomer Nation, Steve Gillen says, it is not just their size that has made boomers unique. Almost from the time they were conceived, boomers were dissected, analyzed, and pitched to by modern marketers who reinforced a sense of generational distinctiveness. Gillen says that the baby boom would prove to be the single greatest demographic event in American history. So who are the baby boomers? Broadly, this generation comes after the silent generation or the traditionalists and before Generation X, which, speaking of, if you want to hear more about the generations in general, be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. Now, the US Census Bureau defined baby boomers as those born between mid-1946 and mid-1964. Although the mid-year delineation is generally removed, that year range is generally agreed upon by many sources. One exception comes from Strauss and Howe, who used 1943 through 1960. In other countries, the baby boomer generation varies around their own increase and decrease in fertility rates, which can vary little as well. The span is generally dictated by timeframes such as when their soldiers came home and when the country adopted the birth control pill. In the US, baby boomers are sometimes divided into two groups. The boomers born between 1946 and somewhere in the mid-50s, usually 1954 to 1956, are called leading edge boomers, or occasionally alpha boomers. Those born from the mid-50s to 1964 and occasionally 1965 are referred to as the trailing edge boomers, or Generation Jones. Leading edge boomers are some of those people you would associate with the 1960s counterculture. They weren't usually the ones leading the movements, that was people from older generations usually, but some participated in the civil rights movements and feminist movements, for example. Of course, not all leading edge boomers were hippies or activists.
It's okay, I'm used to it. I lived through the 60s.
There was also a sizable backlash in the opposite direction.
She had friends who were socialists.
Oh my God.
And as Generation Jones entered adulthood, the West was moving in a more conservative direction. Members of the trailing edge boomer cohort were children during things like Watergate and the oil crisis, and young adults when AIDS was discovered. There's some variation even within this cohort as well. For example, the very youngest are obviously a bit closer to Generation X and were even in high school when MTV came out. One article states, the latest of the late boomers were born the year of the Beatles' first American tour. The earliest of the early boomers would have been 18 years old and screaming in the audience. Another says, while the oldest of the early boomers graduated from college during the Summer of Love, the youngest of the late boomers left college during the Reagan years. Now for some of their earlier milestones, both shared and not, straight from the horse's mouth. 1985, Schumann and Scott asked, what world events over the past 50 years were especially important to you? And they divide the answers between the first and second boomer cohorts, and this was also in the United States. Here were the answers common to both groups. The Cold War and associated Red Scare, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the Vietnam War. The Cold War basically started when the baby boomers did, making them the first full generation to grow up with the threat of nuclear warfare. For those unaware, the Cuban Missile Crisis was the most tense part of the Cold War. It lasted 13 days and may have been the closest we've ever come to nuclear war. The event was in 1962, so not all boomers would remember it, but they were all Cold War kids and adults and would have done those duck and cover drills. The Vietnam War was the other event mentioned by both boomer cohort groups in the survey, but the two cohorts had different experiences of this as well. Earlier boomers were more likely to serve, be drafted, or protest the war, with many boomer infantrymen serving while in their late teens or early 20s. Depending on where you draw the line, no member of Generation Jones would have experienced the draft, but some might have been worried about it, and the war did take up a lot of their childhood and teen years. It was also quite a divisive war. As politician Jim Webb put it, World War II brought the greatest generation together. Vietnam tore the baby boomers apart. It was the aftermath of this war that led to the establishment of the Department of Veterans Affairs, also known as the VA. Those were not the only events boomers mentioned in that survey though, just the ones they had in common. Early boomers also said political unrest, the Apollo program, sexual and drug experimentation, the civil rights movement, environmentalism, second wave feminism, and the Woodstock Festival. Early boomers and those in the first couple years of the next cohort also reported that the assassinations of John F. Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King Jr. were important. And the unique additions from the late boomers / Generation Jones were the moonwalk, the Watergate scandal and Richard Nixon's resignation, the lowering of the drinking age to 18 in many states in the 70s before it moved back up again, the 1973 oil crisis, raging inflation, economic recession and less opportunities after graduating, the Iran hostage crisis, the election of Ronald Reagan as president, and Live Aid. For reference, Schuman and Scott used the years 1946 to 1955 for the leading edge boomers and 1956 to 1964 for the second cohort / Generation Jones, and this survey obviously took place prior to any events that occurred after 1985. In 2016, Pew Research Center did a similar survey, though not exactly the same, where they asked Americans to name the top 10 most significant events that occurred in their lifetime that they think had the biggest impact on the country. The survey was not just for boomers, and in general, events were cited by those who were alive during them. One unique event to the boomers' top 10 was the assassination of Martin Luther King. And here's a study from Australia done by Carrot, asking boomers about events that they thought had the biggest impact, just to show there will be some variation for boomers around the world. In all these cases, I imagine if we did these surveys today, we would be seeing some additions. Now let's talk a little bit about baby boomers and technology. In contrast with newer generations, as you can see, technology is mentioned less in terms of milestones for baby boomers, but that doesn't mean it's not worth mentioning. During their childhoods, helpful products once thought of as luxurious, like the telephone and washing machine, started to become available for the average person. Air conditioning became more common. According to a paper out of Berkeley National Laboratory, in 1940, nearly half of houses lacked hot piped water, a bathtub or shower, or a flush toilet. Over a third of houses didn't have a flush toilet. As late as 1960, over 25% of the houses in 16 states didn't have complete plumbing facilities. So basically things like hot water and indoor plumbing were growing home features during their childhoods. And of course, we're focusing on the US, there's variation throughout the world. The boomers were also the first TV generation. The number of households with TV grew exponentially between the 40s and 60s. The early TVs were black and white with a limited number of channels and no remote, but they were still exciting attention grabbers. Soap operas were big for boomers. Other popular shows depended on age and time, but included things like Leave It to Beaver, Father Knows Best, The Waltons, The Brady Bunch, The Mary Tyler Moore Show, Good Times, MASH, Little House on the Prairie, The Jeffersons, etc. And just to mention some other innovation or newer technologies from around the time they were born or they were young, basically their childhood. Direct local dialing started in the early 50s, meaning before that you had to call the operator to be connected to someone.
Operator, we're having trouble with our phone.
The 1950s was also a big time for DNA-related discoveries. That decade was also the beginning of the jet age. Generally, baby boomers listened to music via radio, vinyl records, and record players, and then some may have used 8-tracks. Cassettes were invented in the early 60s, and the popularity grew from there. LEDs started being produced around that time. Kevlar was invented in 1965. Automatic teller machines, or ATMs, were invented in 69, but became more prevalent in the 80s when boomers were adults or reaching adulthood. Plastics, lasers, transistors, and integrated circuits were also new and impactful. And obviously there were many more. Today, many baby boomers do try to keep up with new technology. A 2011 report found that alpha boomers account for 40% of purchases of technology and gadgets. Adults 55 to 64 are just as likely as those 18 to 34 to have high-definition TVs, digital recorders, and broadband service. They own more iPads and smartphones than any other demo. The pandemic also seemingly led to a growth of technology adoption among boomers, with substantial gains in using things like telehealth, curbside food pickup, smartwatches, and streaming. A 2021 Ipsos poll found that of the generations they surveyed, the baby boomers watched the most TV, with 59% watching more than 10 hours per week. The first television generation does still like their TV. Now for baby boomer characteristics. First, how do they see themselves? In 2012, Pew Research Center asked, what makes your generation unique? Baby boomers polled said work ethic, respectful, values/morals, baby boomers, and smarter. Growing up, many baby boomers believed the world would continue to improve over time. Those who were already well off in terms of standard of living and education were often the most optimistic. In contrast, Generation Jones is said to possess characteristics like pessimism, cynicism, and distrust of the government, a little more in line with Generation X stereotypes. Being called Generation Jones, there are also some traits said to go along with that. GenerationJones.com says, it was in this generation as teens in the 1970s which nationally popularized the slang term Jonesin, meaning a yearning or craving, which has turned out to be a core personality trait of this generation of huge expectations left unfulfilled. Similarly, some members of this generation may feel the competition of keeping up with the Joneses, their populist generation. This mentality has led some boomers to feel unsatisfied with their own accomplishments. Some end up critical of themselves and also extend that to others, including other generations, which perhaps has played a role in some generational conflict. Continuing with characteristics, there are some, of course, which are perceived as less positive. For example, one nickname for the baby boomers is the Me generation. You may associate it or a similar moniker, Generation Me, with the millennials, but it was given to the baby boomers first. Of course, it's clearly typical for the older generation to think things like this of the younger generation, but let's delve into a little more of where it came from in this case. In general, baby boomers had better lifestyles than their parents did as children, and so many were able to think a bit beyond the basics of survival. This, likely combined with heavy marketing towards them, played a role in their consumer-driven culture, though also their post-materialist values. Additionally, writers Tom Wolfe and Christopher Lasch called the 1970s the Me Decade, saying it was a time when narcissism was on the rise among young people. The 1970s was a time of hot tub parties, new exercise and health fads, streaking, and a focus on finding yourself. It was somewhat gradual, but over time there was more of a focus on the self. Self-help, self-realization, self-fulfillment. That's not to say there aren't benefits to those, but the previous cultural attitude was one of social responsibility, so it was a shift. In terms of race, as a generation, the baby boomers are less diverse than the generations that come after them, but slightly more diverse than the preceding generation. On that note, while the civil rights and feminist movements occurred during their childhoods, the boomer experience across race and gender was not equal. For example, after studying 2004, Duke researcher Angela M. Oran said, what surprised us the most was how racial inequality persists among the boomers compared to other generations. The figures are quite dramatic regarding the continuing relative disadvantage of African Americans. Today is particularly difficult for single baby boomer women as well as some minorities to retire due to finances. Another finding from the Duke researchers was that 12% of early boomers and nearly 15% of late boomers are immigrants. In terms of health, in some ways, baby boomers are healthier than past generations at their age. They're smoking less, they're more health conscious, and they're living longer. Today, many baby boomers are considered more active relative to preceding generations at the same age. But they still have some issues and many could be healthier. For example, more boomers have been affected by diabetes and other chronic issues. Some issues may be caused by the increase in fast food starting when they were younger and some older diet fads which were less healthy than first thought. Baby boomers are also 5 times more likely to have hepatitis C than the rest of the population, so if you're a boomer, maybe get that checked out. They're not the only ones, but many baby boomers were also exposed to lead as children, something which is associated with all kinds of problems. Those who are older and less healthy have been particularly vulnerable in recent years. On another note, some characteristics, I found this graphic out of Australia to describe some different types of boomers if you want to look at it for fun. Next, a little on family. Boomers generally had very different childhoods than their parents. This sometimes made it difficult for them to relate to one another, but they did likely have some siblings to relate to. Due to the baby boom, many boomers were a part of large families, often with more siblings than their parents or children. Particularly for early boomers, gender roles were still strong, and so it's not unusual to get married right out of high school. Demographer Philip Longman said, even among baby boomers, those who wound up having children have turned out to be remarkably similar to their parents in their attitudes about family values. So this is one area where they were more similar to their parents. For many young boomer women, there was an expectation that they would marry by 20, and indeed many did. The mean and median age of first birth was still below 24 in 1985 in the US. Of course, there's variation around region and other demographic features. Now, not all these boomer marriages have lasted. No-fault divorce laws came out largely in the 70s and made it easier to get a divorce than in the past. In the US, the early silents really led the first divorce wave, but early boomers were also part of it. While it's an important one, it's probably just one of the contributing factors to the baby boomers having the highest divorce rate of all the generations. As they have aged, boomers have continued to divorce, creating a trend called gray divorce. Keep in mind, some boomers have married and divorced multiple times, which also contributes to this rate. Now, parenting styles that boomers received and administered could be a whole large topic, so we're going to save that one. But generally, baby boomers' parents were either from the greatest or the silent traditionalist generation, and their kids are often millennials. But obviously, there can be a lot of variation. While 1/5 of the women in the US born in the 50s didn't give birth by the end of their typical fertile years, 11% of boomer women had at least 4 children. More religious boomers, especially practicing Christians, had more children than other groups. Despite all the divorces and issues, many baby boomers do value family, and in recent years they have been participating in a trend called baby chasing, where they relocate to be closer to their children and or grandchildren, sometimes to provide support. Now for a little on baby boomers and education. The first recorded use of the term baby boomer is actually from a 1963 article talking about an upcoming surge in college enrollments. In this case, it was in relation to the earliest baby boomers reaching adulthood. But let's back up a little. Early boomer education in the US was a little different than their predecessors, partly due to the Cold War. The government realized they needed more scientists and engineers to compete with the Soviet Union, so Eisenhower issued education reforms, and the government put more money into education, research, and development. The National Defense Education Act, which passed in 1958, provided funding for math, science, and foreign language instruction. Teachers were not really prepared to teach some of these subjects at first, which made it both difficult for them and the students, though. New math, for example, which was introduced around this time, focused more on understanding math concepts than rote memorization, but there were some issues with implementation. It received criticism from some and praise from others. The passing of Brown versus Education in 1954 was also influential on the schooling of the baby boomers. The ruling, of course, made segregation in public schools unconstitutional. This meant some earlier boomers still attended legally segregated schools. In reality, desegregation did not occur overnight, but there were some efforts made towards it. One result of Brown versus Board was busing. Because it didn't begin until the early 70s, this was a more common experience for Generation Jones. It involved transporting children to schools they wouldn't normally attend to diversify the makeup of schools. There was mixed support for this method. Moving on to college. Before World War II, only a very small number of people attended college or university. Of course, even after, it was nowhere near most. Over 10% didn't complete high school, but more people were completing high school and going further with their education. After the war, some governments, including the US, provided subsidies for military veterans to attend school. So some boomers would have had parents who attended college, which is one predictor for how likely you are to attend college yourself. This, plus the addition of general financial aid for university students, and more demand for certain knowledge and skills were contributing factors to an increase in enrollment. One additional motivator for perhaps some early boomer men for attending college was avoidance of the Vietnam draft, as this allowed for deferment. Indeed, leading edge or alpha boomers do appear to be more likely to have advanced college degrees than later boomers. In the 1970s, the number of universities more than doubled to accommodate the large population of baby boomers. These boomers basically created today's university towns and campuses, which have been found to be influential politically. Now for just a tad on the economy/work. In the US, boomers were born or came of age during what is considered the golden age of the US economy. Not all, but there were countries that experienced something similar. For example, 1945 to 1975 are called the 30 glorious years in France. One blogger says, the baby boomers grew up in circumstances that previous generations couldn't have imagined. They played in spacious backyards of detached suburban houses with mortgages subsidized by the GI Bill. They completed secondary education and entered college in greater numbers than ever before. They spent summer vacations riding in family station wagons over newly completed interstate highways. They were the first kids to grow up watching TV. That being said, the poverty rate was high initially, leading to social reforms in the 1960s to help those who were struggling. Most boomers would have benefited from this time as children, but only the earlier boomers would have reached adulthood during this so-called golden age. Of course, there were also other things going on around this time. One time, things grew a little more difficult. In 1982, a New York Times article quoted Landon Y. Hughes as saying, "The generation is like a large group of people moving from a big room into a smaller room. Some will shove their way in, picking up bruises in the process. Others will try to get in and fail. Still, more will not try at all." Some general workforce trends included more women entering the workforce. Some of the new technology like frozen food and washing machines made it so there was less time required to spend on housework. Revlon even launched a perfume called Charlie, the new 1970s woman, which became the world's best-selling perfume. A shift from a manufacturing to service economy, and a growing gap in pay between high-skilled workers and low-skilled workers. Over the course of boomers' lives, there have been various recessions, changing inflation and interest rates, and other things like banks extending credit more in the 90s. These all affected some boomers' lives and finances, but the exact impact depended on which event, which boomers, etc. I'm not going to go into each of those today. While the generation as a whole holds a lot of wealth, it is a misconception that all boomers are wealthy, as there is a fair amount of inequality among the group. On that note, some boomers are continuing to stay in the workforce longer than previous generations, some because they want to or they can, and others because they need to. More recently, while the pandemic has resulted in some boomers choosing to stay in the workforce longer, for many others, they have chosen to retire earlier than they might have otherwise, what is referred to as the Great Retirement. And I want to end by going back to a 1999 AARP report. It said, "Baby boomers represent the largest single sustained growth of the population in the history of the United States. Their mass alone has had an enormous impact on the national psyche, political arena, and social fabric. From the youth culture they created in the 1960s and 1970s to the dual-income households of the 1980s and 90s, this generation has reinterpreted each successive stage of life. As the oldest of the baby boomers, now 52, approach later adulthood, they are again poised to redefine the next stage, retirement." As you can see, while a generation is often portrayed as a homogeneous monolith, as AARP said later, that's not really the case. I hope you enjoyed this video and learned a little bit about the baby boomer generation. If you did, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you want to see more content on the generations. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you next time.